I need to tell you something about Scorpios that most people don't want to admit. And honestly, this might completely change how you see them. Because what I'm about to share isn't just another surface-level astrology take. This is about something deeper. Something that even Scorpios themselves struggle to articulate. Here's the thing. When you meet a Scorpio, when you start getting close to one, you might feel like you're making progress. You might think you're finally understanding them, finally breaking through those walls everyone talks about. But then something happens. You realize there's another layer, and beneath that layer, another one, and beneath that, something else entirely that you never saw coming. Does that resonate? It's like walking into what you think is a simple hallway, only to discover it's actually the entrance to an elaborate maze. And the deeper you go, the more you realize you're not just exploring their personality. You're navigating a structure they've been building their entire life, room by room by room, corridor by corridor, with hidden passages and locked doors that even they've forgotten about. And here's what really gets my attention. This isn't manipulation. This isn't them playing games or trying to confuse you. I really believe this is just how they're wired. The maze isn't something they created to keep you out. It's something they built to survive. Now, if you've ever felt frustrated trying to understand a Scorpio in your life, if you've ever thought you finally knew them only to discover you were completely wrong, stay with me on this one. Because there's a very specific reason why this keeps happening. And I'm going to break it down for you in a way that I think will finally make sense. But first, I need you to understand something fundamental about Scorpio energy. Because without this context, nothing else I'm about to say will land the way it needs to. Scorpio isn't just another zodiac sign with quirky traits and preferences. Scorpio is the sign of transformation, death, rebirth, and the underworld. And when I say underworld, I don't mean that in some mystical, abstract way. I mean the psychological underworld. The parts of human experience that most people don't want to look at. The shadow, the wounds, the things we bury because they're too painful or too complicated or too raw. Every Scorpio carries this energy. They're born with an instinctive understanding that life has layers most people never see. That beneath the surface of every interaction, every relationship, every moment, there's something deeper happening, something true, something that matters more than the polite conversation or the social performance. And because they see this, because they feel this constantly, they can't help but operate on multiple levels simultaneously. When you're talking to a Scorpio, they're not just hearing your words, they're reading your energy. They're noticing what you're not saying. They're feeling the emotional undercurrent. They're analyzing the power dynamic. They're assessing whether you're safe, whether you're real, whether you can handle what they actually think and feel. This is exhausting for them. By the way, absolutely exhausting. But they can't turn it off. And here's where the maze begins to form. Because when you're constantly aware of all these layers, when you're always seeing beneath the surface, you start to realize that most people can't handle the full truth of who you are. Most people want the edited version, the socially acceptable version, the version that doesn't make them uncomfortable or challenge their worldview or force them to look at their own shadows. So Scorpios learn early, usually through painful experience, that they need to compartmentalize. They need to show different parts of themselves to different people. Not because they're fake, but because they're protecting both themselves and others from overwhelm. Think about it like this. Imagine you're carrying around this intense, complex inner world. You feel everything deeply. You see patterns others miss. You understand motivations that people hide even from themselves. You've been through transformations that changed you at a cellular level. You carry wounds that shaped your entire personality. You have desires and fears and insights that would take hours to explain. And even then, most people wouldn't get it. Now imagine trying to share all of that with someone you just met. Or even someone you've known for years. Where do you even start? How do you explain the depth without drowning them? How do you reveal the intensity without scaring them away? You can't. So you don't. Instead, you create rooms, chambers, levels of access. You show people what they can handle, what they've earned the right to see, what feels safe to reveal in that particular moment with that particular person. And this is where people get confused, because they think they know the Scorpio. They think they've seen the real person. But what they've actually seen is the version of that person that was appropriate for their level of intimacy, their capacity for depth, their ability to hold space for complexity. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and honestly, it's made me realize why so many people feel frustrated or even betrayed when they discover new layers to a Scorpio they thought they knew. It's not that the Scorpio lied. It's that the Scorpio revealed what was relevant, what was safe, what made sense in the context of that relationship at that time. But here's what makes this even more complicated. Scorpios don't just hide things from others. They hide things from themselves. This is the part that nobody talks about. The maze isn't just for your protection. It's for theirs too. When you experience intense emotions, when you go through profound transformations, when you carry deep wounds, your psyche develops defense mechanisms. It creates walls and barriers and locked rooms not just to keep others out, but to keep certain parts of yourself contained. Because if you felt everything all at once, if you accessed every memory and every pain and every fear simultaneously, you'd be overwhelmed. You couldn't function. So Scorpios, often unconsciously, create internal mazes. They compartmentalize their own experiences. They lock away certain memories until they're strong enough to process them. They suppress certain desires until it's safe to acknowledge them. They hide certain truths from themselves until they're ready to face them. And this means that even the Scorpio doesn't have a complete map of their own maze. They're discovering new rooms in themselves all the time. They're finding locked doors they didn't know existed. They're stumbling into corridors they thought they'd sealed off years ago. Have you ever had a Scorpio suddenly share something with you that completely contradicts what you thought you knew about them? Have you ever watched them have a realization about themselves that seems to surprise even them? That's not inconsistency. That's not them being fake or confused. That's them discovering another room in their own internal maze. That's them finding a key to a door they'd forgotten about. And here's what I think is really important to understand. This isn't a flaw. This isn't something wrong with Scorpios. This is actually a profound form of psychological sophistication. Most people operate on one or two levels. They have a public self and maybe a private self. They show the world one face and keep another face for close relationships. That's normal. That's healthy. But Scorpios operate on multiple levels simultaneously. They have the public self, the private self, the intimate self, the shadow self, the aspirational self, the wounded self, the powerful self, the vulnerable self. And all of these selves are real. All of these selves are true. They're just activated in different contexts, with different people, in different moments. This is why you can know a Scorpio for years and still be surprised by them. Because you've been interacting with certain selves, certain rooms in the maze. But there are other rooms you haven't accessed yet. Other versions of them that only emerge under specific conditions. And the wild part? They're not consciously deciding which self to show you. It happens organically based on the energy of the interaction, the level of trust, the emotional safety, the power dynamic, the context. I've noticed this in my own interactions with Scorpios. The person they are when we're alone is different from the person they are in a group. The person they are when they feel safe is different from the person they are when they feel threatened. The person they are when they're in their power is different from the person they are when they're vulnerable. And all of these versions are authentic. None of them are fake. They're just different facets of an incredibly complex personality. But here's where it gets tricky for the people trying to understand them. Because we want consistency. We want people to be the same person all the time. We want to be able to predict behavior, to know what to expect, to feel like we have a handle on who someone is. And Scorpios can't give you that, not because they don't want to, but because they're fundamentally not built that way. They're built for transformation, for depth, for complexity. They're built to contain multitudes. So when you approach a Scorpio, when you try to get close to them, you're not just getting to know a person, you're entering a maze. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that complete knowledge might be impossible. Not because they're deliberately hiding from you, but because they're still discovering themselves. Because new rooms keep appearing. Because transformation is their nature. And transformation means constant change, constant evolution, constant revelation of new layers. And honestly, I think that's beautiful. I think that's what makes Scorpios so magnetic, so fascinating, so impossible to forget once you've really encountered them. But it's also why you'll never truly know them. Not completely, not fully, not in the way you might know other signs. Because knowing a Scorpio isn't about reaching some final destination where you've seen everything and understand everything. Knowing a Scorpio is about being willing to keep exploring, to keep discovering, to keep being surprised, to accept that there will always be another door, another corridor, another hidden chamber. And the question isn't whether you can map the entire maze. The question is whether you're brave enough to keep walking deeper into it, knowing you might never find the center, knowing you might never see it all, but trusting that every new room you discover is worth the journey. I want to talk about something that I think is crucial to understanding this maze dynamic, because there's a specific pattern that happens when people try to get close to Scorpios, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's what typically happens. You meet a Scorpio. There's this immediate intensity, this magnetic pull. They seem to see right through you in a way that's both thrilling and terrifying. You feel like you've met someone who finally gets it, who operates on your wavelength, who understands things other people miss. And in those early stages, they might share things with you. Deep things, vulnerable things, things that make you feel special, chosen, like you've been granted access to something rare and precious. And you have been. That's real. But then something shifts. Maybe weeks later. Maybe months later. You realize there's a whole dimension to them you never suspected. Maybe you meet their family and discover they're completely different around them. Maybe you see them in a crisis and a version of them emerges that you've never encountered. Maybe they casually mention an experience from their past that completely reframes everything you thought you understood about them. And you feel confused. Maybe even betrayed. Because you thought you knew them. You thought you'd reached some level of intimacy that meant full disclosure. But what you're discovering is that you'd only been given access to certain rooms in the maze. And there are entire wings you didn't know existed. This is where most relationships with Scorpios hit a crisis point. Because the other person feels deceived. They feel like the Scorpio wasn't being honest. They feel like they've been played or manipulated or kept at arm's length, despite the apparent intimacy. But here's what I've come to understand, and this was a huge realization for me. The Scorpio wasn't lying. They were being as honest as they could be in that moment. With that level of trust. In that particular context. The problem is that honesty for a Scorpio isn't a simple binary. It's not just truth versus lies. It's about which truth, which layer, which room in the maze is appropriate to reveal right now. Think about it this way. Imagine you're a Scorpio and you've been through something traumatic. Maybe a betrayal, maybe a loss, maybe an experience that fundamentally changed you. That experience created certain defense mechanisms, certain ways of protecting yourself, certain patterns of behavior that help you feel safe. Now someone new comes into your life. Someone you're starting to care about. Do you immediately dump all of that trauma on them? Do you explain every defense mechanism and why it exists? Do you reveal every wound and every scar and every way you've been broken and rebuilt? Of course not. That would be overwhelming. That would be inappropriate. That would potentially drive them away before they've had a chance to see your strength, your depth, your capacity for transformation. So you share what feels manageable. You reveal what feels relevant. You open doors gradually, testing whether this person can handle what's behind them, whether they're going to run, whether they're going to judge, whether they're going to use your vulnerabilities against you. And this is where people get it wrong. They think this gradual revelation is manipulation. They think it's the Scorpio being calculating or strategic or withholding. But it's not. It's protection. It's wisdom. It's the result of having been hurt before by revealing too much too soon to people who couldn't handle it. I've watched this play out so many times. Someone gets close to a Scorpio, feels like they've been let into the inner circle, and then gets upset when they discover there are more circles beyond that one. More layers, more complexity, more depth than they initially realized. And the Scorpio is oft ungenuinely confused by this reaction. Because from their perspective, they've been incredibly open. They've shared things they don't share with most people. They've been vulnerable in ways that terrify them. They've given access to rooms in the maze that very few people ever see. But the other person is measuring intimacy by a different standard. They're thinking in terms of complete transparency. Total disclosure. No secrets. No hidden rooms. And that's just not how Scorpios work. That's not how their psyche is structured. Here's another thing that makes this even more complicated. Scorpios don't just have hidden rooms. They have rooms that only exist under certain conditions. Rooms that only appear when specific rigors are activated. Rooms that emerge during particular emotional states or life circumstances. Let me give you an example. I know a Scorpio who, Scorpio, in their everyday life, is incredibly controlled, measured, almost stoic. They present as someone who has it all together, who's processed their trauma, who's moved beyond their past. And that's true. That version of them is real. But put them in a situation that echoes an old wound. That triggers a deep fear. That activates an ancient defense mechanism. And suddenly a completely different person emerges. Someone raw. Someone reactive. Someone operating from a place of pure survival instinct. And this isn't them being fake or inconsistent. This is a room in the maze that only opens under specific conditions. The people who love this Scorpio, who think they know them, are often shocked when they see this other version. They don't understand where it came from. They feel like they're dealing with a stranger, and the Scorpio themselves might be surprised by it too. Because they thought they'd locked that room, thought they'd moved past that version of themselves. But trauma doesn't work that way. Wounds don't work that way. The maze doesn't work that way. Just because you haven't visited a room in years doesn't mean it's gone. It's still there, waiting, and under the right circumstances, or the wrong circumstances, you'll find yourself back in it. This is why I say you'll never truly know a Scorpio. Because even they don't know all their rooms. Even they can't predict which version of themselves will emerge under pressure. Even they're still discovering corridors they didn't know existed. And here's what's really fascinating about this. The maze isn't static. It's not like you could, given enough time and effort, eventually map the whole thing and then you'd be done. The maze is alive. It's growing. It's changing. New rooms are being built even as old ones are being renovated or sealed off. Every experience a Scorpio has, every transformation they go through, every wound they heal or fail to heal, every relationship that shapes them, every loss they endure, every victory they achieve, all of it adds to the maze, creates new passages, builds new chambers, locks new doors. I've seen Scorpios go through major life events, breakups, career changes, spiritual awakenings, and emerge as what feels like completely different people. Not because they were being fake before, but because the experience created new rooms, new layers, new dimensions to their personality that didn't exist before. And the people who knew them before the transformation often struggle with this. They want the old version back. They want the person they thought they knew. They don't understand that the Scorpio has evolved, has added new wings to their maze, has become more complex, not less. This is the nature of Scorpio energy. Constant death and rebirth, constant transformation, constant evolution. The maze is never finished because the person is never finished. They're always becoming, always changing, always discovering new depths within themselves. Now, I want to address something that I think is really important. Because there's a difference between healthy complexity and unhealthy compartmentalitlessly. There's a difference between having natural layers and deliberately hiding things to maintain control or avoid intimacy. Some Scorpios, especially ones who haven't done their healing work, use the maze as a weapon. They use their complexity as an excuse to never be fully present, never be fully vulnerable, never let anyone truly close. They keep people perpetually off balance, perpetually guessing, perpetually trying to earn access to rooms that might not even exist. This is the shadow side of Scorpio energy. The manipulation, the power games, the deliberate mystification, and it's important to distinguish this from the natural, healthy complexity I've been describing. A healthy Scorpio maze is one where the rooms exist organically, where the layers are real, where the complexity comes from genuine depth and lived experience. An unhealthy Scorpio maze is one where the complexity is manufactured, where the mystery is performed, where the inaccessibility is a defense mechanism that's become a prison. How do you tell the difference? I think it comes down to intention and growth. A healthy Scorpio is actively working to understand their own maze. They're doing the therapy, the shadow work, the self-reflection. They're trying to unlock their own doors, to understand their own patterns, to integrate their different selves. They might not always succeed, but they're trying. An unhealthy Scorpio is invested in keeping the maze mysterious. Even to themselves, they're not interested in integration or understanding. They're interested in maintaining the mystique, the power, the control that comes from being unknowable. And here's the thing. Most Scorpios fall somewhere in between. They're doing some of the work but not all of it. They're aware of some of their patterns but not others. They're trying to be more accessible but still protecting themselves in ways that create distance. This is human. This is normal. This is the reality of being a complex person trying to navigate relationships in a world that often demands simplicity. But I think it's important for people who love Scorpios to understand this distinction. Because you need to know whether you're dealing with someone who's genuinely complex and still figuring themselves out, or someone who's using complexity as a shield to avoid real intimacy. One of the most telling signs is how a Scorpio responds when you point out inconsistencies or contradictions. A healthy Scorpio will be curious. They'll want to understand. They might be defensive at first, because nobody likes having their blind spots pointed out. But ultimately they'll engage with it. They'll consider it. They'll do the work to understand why they showed up differently in different contexts. An unhealthy Scorpio will deflect. They'll gaslight. They'll make you feel crazy for noticing. They'll turn it around and make it about your inability to handle their depth or complexity. They'll use your confusion as proof that you're not evolved enough to understand them. This matters because the maze metaphor can be used to excuse behavior that shouldn't be excused. It can be used to justify inconsistency, unreliability, or emotional unavailability, and that's not fair. That's not healthy. That's not what I'm advocating for when I talk about accepting Scorpio complexity. What I am saying is this. If you're in relationship with a Scorpio who's doing their work, who's genuinely trying to understand themselves, who's willing to let you into more rooms as trust builds, who's not using their complexity as a weapon, then yes, you need to accept that you'll never fully know them. You need to accept the maze. You need to be okay with ongoing discovery and occasional surprise. But if you're dealing with someone who's using their Scorpio nature as an excuse to never be accountable, never be consistent, never be truly vulnerable, then the maze isn't the problem. The person is. And no amount of astrological understanding should make you accept treatment that doesn't feel good or relationships that don't feel reciprocal. I think this is where a lot of people get stuck. They read about Scorpio intensity and depth and mystery, and they think that means they have to accept whatever behavior comes their way. They think that being confused or kept at a distance is just part of loving a Scorpio, and that's not true. Healthy relationships, even with the most complex Scorpios, should still have some baseline of consistency, reliability, and mutual vulnerability. The maze should be something you explore together, not something they use to keep you perpetually lost and off balance. I want to talk about what it actually takes to navigate a Scorpio's maze. Because I think this is where most people either give up or get lost. And honestly, understanding this might be the most important part of this entire conversation. Here's what I've learned. You can't approach a Scorpio's maze the way you'd approach a puzzle. You can't treat it like something to be solved, where once you figure out the pattern, you're done. That mindset will drive you crazy and probably drive them away. The maze isn't a problem to be solved. It's a landscape to be explored, and exploration requires a completely different set of skills than problem solving does. First, you need patience. Real patience. Not the kind where you're secretly keeping score of how long it's taking them to open up. Not the kind where you're waiting for them to finally be normal or simple or easy to understand. I mean the kind of patience that accepts that this is a lifelong journey, that there will always be more to discover, that the goal isn't to reach some finish line where you finally know everything. I've watched people get frustrated with Scorpios because they feel like they're not making progress fast enough. They've been together for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and they're still discovering new things, still being surprised, still feeling like there are parts of their Scorpio they don't understand, and they interpret this as a failure, as evidence that something's wrong with the relationship or that the Scorpio isn't really letting them in. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is exactly what should be happening. You're continuing to discover. You're continuing to go deeper. You're continuing to find new rooms. And if you can shift your perspective from frustration to curiosity, from impatience to wonder, the whole experience transforms. Second, you need to be comfortable with ambiguity. This is huge. Most people want clear answers. They want to know exactly where they stand, exactly what someone thinks and feels, exactly what's going to happen next. They want certainty. Scorpios can't give you that. Not because they're being difficult, but because they themselves are often sitting in ambiguity. They're holding multiple truths simultaneously. They're feeling contradictory emotions. They're in the process of becoming something they can't yet articulate. I know a Scorpio who, when asked how they feel about something important, will often say, "I don't know yet." And people interpret this as evasiveness or avoidance. But it's not. It's honesty. They genuinely don't know yet because they're still feeling into it, still discovering what's true for them, still waiting for clarity to emerge from the complexity. If you need immediate, clear, definitive answers from a Scorpio, you're going to be disappointed. But if you can sit in the not knowing with them, if you can be comfortable with "I'm still figuring that out," or "I feel multiple things about this," or "I need time to understand what I'm experiencing," then you can actually be present for their process instead of trying to rush them through it. Third, and this is critical, you need to be doing your own inner work. You need to be exploring your own maze. Because here's what I've noticed. The people who struggle most with Scorpio complexity are often people who haven't done much self-exploration themselves. They're operating from a relatively simple, surface-level understanding of their own psychology, and they expect others to be equally simple. But Scorpios can sense this. They can feel when someone doesn't have the depth to meet them where they are, and they'll instinctively keep those people at a certain distance. Not out of snobbery or judgment, but out of self-preservation. Because sharing deep, complex, shadow-level material with someone who hasn't done their own shadow work is like speaking a foreign language to someone who doesn't understand it. It's exhausting and ultimately futile. The people who successfully navigate Scorpio mazes are usually people who have their own mazes. People who understand complexity because they've encountered it in themselves. People who've done therapy or shadow work or deep self-reflection. People who know what it's like to discover something about yourself that contradicts what you thought you knew. People who've experienced their own transformations and understand that change isn't linear or simple. When two people with mazes meet, there's a recognition. There's a mutual understanding that depth is normal, that complexity is natural, that having multiple layers isn't a flaw or a defense mechanism. It's just what happens when you're a conscious, evolving human being. Fourth, You need to respect boundaries without taking them personally. This is where so many people get tripped up. A Scorpio will set a boundary. Will say, I'm not ready to talk about that yet, or I need some space to process this, or that's not something I share with people. And the other person hears rejection. They hear you're not important enough, or I don't trust you, or I'm keeping you at a distance. But that's not what's being said. What's being said is I'm protecting something precious, something vulnerable, something that needs to be handled carefully. And I'm not sure yet if this is the right time, or if you're the right person, or if I even have the words to explain it. Scorpios are incredibly protective of their inner world. They have to be. They've learned it, usually through painful experience, that not everyone can be trusted with their depths. That some people will use their vulnerabilities against them. That some people will be overwhelmed or frightened or judgmental. That some people will take what they share and twist it or minimize it, or fail to understand its significance. So when a Scorpio sets a boundary, they're not rejecting you, they're protecting themselves. And if you can respect that boundary without making it about you, without pressuring them to explain or justify it, without punishing them for having it, you're actually proving that you're safe. You're demonstrating that you can handle their complexity without needing to control it or fully understand it. Over time, as trust builds, many of those boundaries will naturally soften. Doors that were locked will open. Rooms that were off limits will become accessible. But this happens on the Scorpio's timeline, not yours. And trying to force it, trying to rush it, trying to guilt or manipulate them into opening up before they're ready. That's the fastest way to get permanently locked out. You need to be willing to be surprised. This sounds simple, but it's actually really challenging for most people. We like to think we know the people we're close to. We like to be able to predict their reactions, understand their motivations, anticipate their needs. It makes us feel secure, like we have a handle on the relationship. But with Scorpios, you have to release that need for predictability. You have to be okay with them showing up differently than you expected. You have to be able to hold space for contradictions, for evolutions, for versions of them you haven't met yet. I remember talking to someone who'd been married to a Scorpio for 15 years, and they said something that really stuck with me. They said, I've learned to greet my partner every day as if I'm meeting them for the first time. Not because they're inconsistent or unreliable, but because they're always growing, always changing, always revealing new facets. And if I approach them with assumptions about who they are based on who they were yesterday or last year, I miss who they're becoming today. That's profound. That's what it takes. That willingness to stay curious, to stay open. To let the person you love continue to surprise you instead of trying to freeze them into a fixed identity that feels safe and knowable. Now, I want to address something that I think is really important, especially for Scorpios who might be watching this. Because I've been talking a lot about what it takes for others to navigate your maze. But I think you also need to hear this. Your complexity is real. Your depth is real. Your need for privacy and protection is valid. But you also have a responsibility in relationships. You can't use your maze as an excuse to never let anyone truly close. You can't hide behind your complexity to avoid the vulnerability that real intimacy requires. I've seen Scorpios who are so invested in being mysterious, so attached to being unknowable, that they sabotage every relationship that gets too close. They create tests that no one can pass. They move the goalposts every time someone starts to understand them. They use their depth as a weapon to keep people perpetually off balance and perpetually trying to earn access that will never be fully granted. And I get it. I understand the fear. I understand that being truly known is terrifying. I understand that every time you've been vulnerable in the past, it's ended badly. I understand that your maze is your protection, your fortress, your way of staying safe in a world that's hurt you. But here's the truth. If you never let anyone in, if you never take the risk of being truly seen, you're not protecting yourself. You're imprisoning yourself. You're choosing loneliness over the possibility of connection. You're deciding that the pain of past betrayals is more powerful than the potential for future love. and that's a choice you're allowed to make. But you need to be honest about it. You need to acknowledge that you're choosing safety over intimacy, control over vulnerability, mystery over connection. You can't blame other people for not understanding you if you're not willing to be understood. You can't complain about being alone if you're actively keeping everyone at a distance. The healthiest Scorpios I know are the ones who've learned to balance their need for privacy with their need for connection. They still have their maze. They still have their layers. They still have rooms that not everyone gets to see. But they've also learned to identify the people who are worth the risk. The people who've proven themselves trustworthy. The people who can handle their depth without being overwhelmed by it. And with those people, they practice radical vulnerability. They open doors they usually keep locked. They share things they usually keep hidden. They let themselves be seen in ways that terrify them. Not because they've lost their boundaries or their protection, but because they've decided that this person, this relationship, is worth the risk. This is the work. This is the growth. This is what it means to evolve beyond the shadow side of Scorpio energy. You don't have to become simple or surface level or easy to understand. You don't have to give up your complexity or your depth, your need for transformation. But you do have to be willing to let the right people into your maze. You do have to be willing to hand over the map. Even if it's incomplete. Even if it's constantly changing. Even if it scares you. Because here's what I've learned. The people who truly love you don't need to know every room in your maze. They don't need to understand every layer or every contradiction or every version of you. What they need is to know that you're willing to let them explore. That you're not going to punish them for getting lost. That you're going to be patient with their confusion and their questions and their occasional frustration. That you're in this together. Both of you navigating the complexity. Both of you committed to the journey even when it's hard. That's what real intimacy with a Scorpio looks like. It's not about reaching some final destination where everything is known and understood and settled. It's about the willingness to keep walking deeper into the maze together. To keep discovering new rooms together. To keep being surprised and challenged and transformed by what you find. And for the people who love Scorpios, I want you to understand this. The maze isn't a bug. It's a feature. The complexity isn't something to be fixed or simplified or overcome. It's the essence of who they are. And if you can learn to love the maze itself, if you can find beauty in the mystery and excitement in the discovery and meaning in the ongoing exploration, then you'll experience a depth of connection that most people never even know is possible. Because loving a Scorpio isn't easy. It requires more patience, more self-awareness, more emotional intelligence, more willingness to sit in discomfort than loving most other signs. But the reward is a relationship that never gets boring, never gets stale, never gets predictable. A relationship where you're constantly growing, constantly learning, constantly being invited into deeper levels of intimacy and understanding. You'll never truly know them. That's the truth. But you can spend a lifetime getting closer. You can spend decades discovering new rooms, new layers, new dimensions, and every discovery will feel like a gift, like a privilege, like being trusted with something precious and rare. So if you're in love with a Scorpio, if you're trying to understand one, if you're frustrated by their complexity or confused by their contradictions, I want you to take a breath. I want you to release the need to figure them out completely. I want you to embrace the maze. Because the maze isn't keeping you out. It's inviting you in. It's asking you to be brave enough to explore, patient enough to get lost, humble enough to admit you don't have all the answers, and committed enough to keep walking even when you can't see where the path leads. And if you can do that, if you can love them in their complexity instead of despite it, if you can see their depth as a gift instead of a burden, then you'll discover something most people never find. You'll discover what it means to truly know someone, not by mapping every corner of their soul, but by being willing to explore it forever, room by room by room by room, layer by layer, transformation by transformation. That's the real secret. You don't need to know everything.